Nearly all of us have played video games at one point or another, and while we remember them for many reasons, most of us have never even thought of one aspect of video games that can ruin our experience. Consider a video game where your enemies are far stronger than you, or that they have invincibility frames when you don't. These things will ruin the player's experience and might even drive away people from the game itself. These sorts of games are often labeled as bad design. It's a common term we've all heard, but it's something that's not quite well understood. An example of bad design is when a game expects you to perform a complicated mechanic without first teaching you that mechanic in a much simpler form. This is why it is extremely important that enemies are balanced and fun while also being competitive at the same time. This hard equilibrium is one of the many reasons why some games are just not loved by people. And in order to investigate this matter further, let's take a look at one of the very popular video games from the 1990s called Streets of Rage 2, the popular beat-em-up game made in 1993 from Sega. This game is often regarded as one of the best games ever made by Sega, and many people undertook the task of speedrunning the game. Of course, the video I have running is not a speedrun, but it is often performed by a player called Anthopants that you can search on YouTube. The enemies in Streets of Rage 2 are introduced in terms of varying difficulty, where your first encounter is actually with a Galcia. Galcia only has one punch, a jab animation, and usually Galcia actually stands around the player or circles around him, but actually gives the player priority. He doesn't punch the player as soon as he gets in range, but rather he waits for a little bit. He's the punching bag on which the player can get accustomed to the feeling of the game, especially when this game does not have a tutorial, but it is simple in design. The very first phase of this game is where the player is supposed to learn how to do his specials, how to do all the attack patterns, and figure out what they have to figure out. And that even if they do get hit in the process, it's not that they lose a life, but rather they take some damage that they can heal off of later on. But one additional thing of having such an enemy is that you can have this enemy in further complicated difficulty in a different form of sprite sheet. Consider on the screen right now, there is a Galcia again, but this time he's wearing green. And this enemy is far more faster in its patterns and less forgiving in how fast you act. This enemy might not wait as long as the blue version of Galcia and might punch you almost immediately as soon as you get in range. But even if a player thinks that this sort of enemy is too simple, this enemy becomes a nuisance later on, as I will show you right now. So in the very final boss of the game, these enemies actually spawn over and over again. So while the boss is actually clubbing you down, try to do a combo, you will notice that same Galcia is going to jab you once and break your combo, and then that will subsequently lead to the final boss of the game actually hitting you with his shotgun. And this is why this enemy is a really good example of good design, because he can actually be a learning lesson for the player, but then later on he is also a nuisance, and he can also be further expanded on in more complicated attack patterns by just giving him a 3-color sprite. So he's not perfect, but it's deliberate that he's not perfect. So going back to the very beginning of our tutorial, here you can see that there's 2 more enemies that are being introduced. One of them is wearing yellow, and then the other one is actually bald, one of his characteristics. Both of these enemies introduce the player to the idea of 2 different advantages and disadvantages. So the bald enemy can actually hit the player when the player tries to hit the enemy with anything that has jumping involved. They're notoriously known for their uppercut. If the player tries to do any attack that involves jumping, they will almost always uppercut you. So uppercutting them is not a good strategy. On the other side, the yellow shirt, they usually slide in. So it's not a good idea to actually stay on the ground, but it's better to jump against them because they're always sliding on the ground. And in between 2 situations where the player and the enemy hit each other, the player is always given a priority in a 50-50 situation so that the player can actually feel like they are the center of attention and it's not the enemies that are getting priority over them. So going fast forward, one more thing that this game does actually is actually in the beginning part of the map, the game expects you to take damage. And since it expects you to take damage, that's why they also have an apple that heals you for 35% of your health right as you finish the very beginning part of the level, because the game expects you to make mistakes and the game expects you to take damage. So that's why there's actually there's actually an apple right here. So you can heal off of that, and that also helps with progressing of the level. So there's a few things that we can summarize from this experience. One of those things is that enemies in the beginning part of the game have to be simple. They do not have to be complicated. And the reason for that is that if you expect the player to do something very difficult from the beginning without introducing something a lot simpler first, then the player might even turn away from the game because they just feel like the game is unfair to them. The other thing is priority. So in a 50-50 situation, this game always gives priority to the player. If the enemy and the player attack at the same time, the player gets the benefit of the doubt, and that's very useful because what that does is it reinforces the idea that you are the center of attention, not the enemies that are the center of attention. The third thing is actually how the enemies are smart, but they are also in a way stupid, so that they can give the player a better chance at reacting. And what that also does is that you can have varying difficulty, so that if you have a higher difficulty, maybe they do not wait as long to give the player a chance to respond to their movement. Finally, the idea of sprite sheets. So, having an enemy in a simpler form, even if it feels like it can be improved on, is actually a good thing, because that means that you can reuse the same sprite sheet later for a different color, while also changing up the behavior and the patterns a little bit, maybe making it a little bit more aggressive, or maybe making it a little bit different in how it behaves. So this is my video on enemy design. This sort of an enemy design is guaranteed to work, as this game is often loved by people because of its balance and how well rounded it was in terms of the enemy. So this is my video. Thank you very much.